Good morning, everyone, on behalf of the New York Encounter, and welcome. My name is Annie Thompson, and I'm a teaching fellow at St. John's College in Santa Fe, and I'm delighted to introduce you to our panelists. We are so lucky to have these vibrant Tolkien scholars with us, and we're going to have a conversation on Tolkien and hope. You can find their full biographies on the Encounter website, but I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of them now. To my far left is Michael Drout. He is the Francis A. Shirley Professor of English and Director of the Center for the Study of the Medieval at Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts, where since 1997 he has taught Old and Middle English, science fiction, and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. He has published over 100 books and articles on Tolkien, and fantasy and science fiction and medieval literature, and he's the co-founder and co-editor of the journal Tolkien Studies. In the middle, we have Giuseppe Pezzini. He's the tutorial fellow at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. He worked as an assistant editor for the Oxford Dictionary of Medieval Latin until its completion. He is the author of 5 books, including a monograph on Tolkien's theory of fiction, which is forthcoming, so keep a lookout for that. Professor Pezzini is also the Tolkien editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies, and he is a founder of the Oxford Tolkien Network, a research center based at the University of Oxford. And here to my left is Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor. He's the president of Signum University and the Mythgard Institute. In addition to teaching classes on Tolkien, Chaucer, and modern fantasy literature for Signum, Dr. Olsen has extended the concept of the digital classroom to include non-traditional outlets. On his teaching website, The Tolkien Professor, Dr. Olsen brings his scholarship on Tolkien to the public, seeking to engage a wide and diverse audience in serious intellectual and literary conversation. So for our first question, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to take a moment to share with us how Tolkien depicts and characterizes hope in some particular scenes of The Lord of the Rings. And I wanted to start by pointing out that in his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien suggests that one reason we turn to story or to fantasy is to recover and regain, as he says, a clear view. Quote, seeing things as they are, as we were or are meant to see them, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity. So I want these speakers to help us see with fresh eyes the dynamic of hope as Tolkien depicts it. So how does Tolkien depict and characterize hope?
Can you hear me? Oh. So the way we are going to address the question is we have selected a scene, 3 scenes from The Lord of the Rings, which we're going to follow. And I started just because we have followed chronological order in a way, because I think with Tolkien, it's much better to read rather than to talk about Tolkien. So that's what we're going to do. And the episode that I have chosen is the dialogue between Galadriel, Frodo, and Sam in Lorien or Lothlorien. If you remember it from the movie, just to refresh your memory, Galadriel is an elvish queen. She is the eldest and most powerful elf of Middle-earth at the time of the Lord of the Rings. And she's one of the keepers of the 3 rings of power. If you have heard his name recently, she's as one of the 3 rings of power. And what is the power of the 3 rings of power of the elves? And Tolkien explains it very well in a letter, which I'm going to read now. So, quote, the rings are operative in preserving the memory of the beauty of old, maintaining enchanted enclaves of peace where time seems to stand still and decay is restrained. So that's the power of the ring. The enchanted, timeless enclave is, of course, Lorien or Lothlorien, the golden wood, the wood made of gold, which in a sense is a place set in the Golden Age. And in a way, this idea of the Golden Age epitomizes what Tolkien describes as to be the key motive of the elves. And I quote again from the letters. The prevention or slowing of decay, so changed view as a regrettable thing, the preservation of what is desired of love or its semblance, that's an elvish motive, end quote. Just to make it clear, Tolkien loves the elves. Tolkien is a great lover of the elves, and for biographical reasons, in a sense, he sympathizes very much with their sense of loss, with their nostalgia for a lost past. And yet, this embalming position of the elves, as he calls it in another letter, is problematic, is partial. In fact, he writes, and I quote, mere change in my world is not represented as evil. It is the unfolding of the story. And to refuse change is, of course, against the design of God. But the elvish weakness is, in these terms, naturally to regret the past and to become unwilling to face change, as if a man were to hate a very long book still going on and wish to settle down in a favorite chapter, end quote. And my own favorite chapter is the Mirror of Galadriel, which is where we find this beautiful dialogue between Galadriel and Frodo, where Galadriel spells out very clearly this elvish drama. And I read, and this is Galadriel speaking to Frodo. Do you not see now wherefore your coming is to us as the footstep of doom? For if you fail, then we are laid bare to the enemy. Yet if you succeed, then our power is diminished. And Lothlorien will fade, and the tides of time will sweep it away. End quote. So if Frodo succeeds in destroying the ring, Galadriel will also lose her power and eventually risk being forgotten. And of course, we may say that she has another option apart from being forgotten or be destroyed by the enemy, which is the one that Frodo offers to him in the very moment. And that's the kind of a temptation to avoid dwindling, if you want, which is to take up the ring and use it against Sauron as, and some comments aside, and I think it's interesting, he said, yes, you should do that, so you will put things to rights. But as we know, Galadriel will say, and I quote, Galadriel to Frodo, and now at last he comes. You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord, you will set up a queen, and it shall not be dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night. So, as we know, thanks God, Galadriel resists the temptation of fighting power with power, because that's what the ring means. And in a way, she redeems the history of her people. And also, going back to what Annie was saying, she gains herself. She regains herself. And I read, I passed the test, she said at the end. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. So she doesn't lose herself. But what has all this to do with hope? I will say everything has to do with hope. Galadriel's decision is entirely about hope, or rather Estel, as the Elvis will call it, naked hope. That's what Estel means. The hope of those who accept the loss of everything to diminish, and I quote from a beautiful letter, nakedly confront the will of God in time. And it is not coincidence that Galadriel decides to give up the power of her ring under the light of the star Erendil, which is shining upon her, and Erendil is the star of high hope in Tolkien's world. Only hope allows us to refuse power, to accept the changes of time, and thereby to overcome the great temptation of our people, the embalming temptation. And what is the foundation of Galadriel's hope? I will not spell it out because I think they will be developing the following conversation we're going to have with Corey and Michael, but let me just read a passage which I think spells out narratively, not in words, what is Galadriel's hope about. And that's Galadriel's final words to Sam before they leave Lorien. For you, little gardener and lover of trees, I have only one small gift. In this box, and she gives it the box, there is earth from my orchard, and such blessing as Galadriel has still to bestow is upon it. though you shall find all barren and lay waste on your return, there will be few gardens in Middle-earth that will bloom like your garden, if you sprinkle this earth there. Then you may remember Galadriel, and catch a glimpse far off of Lorien, which you have seen only in our winter. And, end of quote. So Lorien will be abandoned, but its life and light will not be lost. Galadriel will leave Middle-earth, but her memory will be preserved. Not embalmed. It's not an embalmed memory, but an alive memory, growing in new and unexpected places in the Shire of the Hobbits. Galadriel accepts to lose her own power because she knows that there is a higher power in history which will bring life to barren and forgotten places according to his design in time. As Tolkien says in another beautiful letter, what is really important is always hid from contemporaries, and the seeds of what is to be are quietly germinating in the dark in some forgotten corner, end quote. Galadriel's seed will germinate, and the Golden Age will return at the end of the Lord of the Rings. Gold is the dominant color in the final chapter of the Lord of the Rings. Yet, this is not achieved through a strategy of power. It's not achieved as a preservation project, but as an unexpected gift. The fruit of naked hope, accepted and shared with generosity. And the quote, the final quote, some at the end of the Lord of the Rings, some planted saplings and put a grain of the precious dust in the soil at the root of each. All through the winter, he remained as patient as he could. Spring surpassed his wildest hopes. His trees began to sprout and grow, as if time was in a hurry and wished to make 1 year do for 20. In the party field, a beautiful young sapling leaped up. He had silver bark and long leaves and burst into golden flowers.
So the passage I thought of is one I came back to a number of times during the COVID and lockdown era, and then the time immediately after that also. And this context is that Frodo, Sam, and Gollum have left the protection that Faramir had given them in Henneth Anun, and they're heading south to go into Mordor. They're going to the crossroads, where they're then are going to go and end up in Shelob's lair and everything that comes after that. But before that happens, and just as Sauron's enormous pall of dark smoke and mist has come out of Mordor, they reach this spot, and the sun was sinking, finding at last the hem of the great slow-rolling pall of cloud, and falling in ominous fire toward the yet unsullied sea. The brief glow fell upon a huge sitting figure, still and solemn as the great stone kings of Argonath. The years had gnawed it, and violent hands had maimed it. Its head was gone, and in its place was set in mockery a round, rough-hewn stone, rudely painted by savage hands in the likeness of a grinning face, with one large red eye in the midst of its forehead. Upon its knees and mighty chair, and all about the pedestal, were idle scrawls mixed with the foul symbols that the maggot folk of Mordor used. Suddenly, caught by the level beams, Frodo saw the old king's head. It was lying rolled away by the roadside. "Look, Sam," he cried, startled into speech. "Look, the king has got a crown again." The eyes were hollow, and the carven beard was broken, but about the high, stern forehead there was a coronal of silver and gold. A trailing plant with flowers like small white stars had bound itself across the brow as if in reverence for the fallen king, and in the crevices of his stony hair, yellow stone crop gleamed. "They cannot conquer forever," said Frodo. And then suddenly the brief glimpse was gone, the sun dipped and vanished, and as if at the shuddering of a lamp, black night fell. So the hope there expressed by Frodo is as close to saying literally the darkest moment when Sauron's clouds have blotted out the actual sun, and there's going to be the day without sun, the next, and the attacks and everything else there. Frodo sees the truth that they cannot conquer forever. And this is related to something Tolkien said in his famous 1936 lecture on Beowulf, Beowulf the Monsters and the Critics, where he says the theme of Beowulf and essentially the tragedy of Beowulf is that for that pre-Christian era, when the poem is set, Tolkien says, within time, the monsters would win. But the difference is, within time doesn't matter when there is the larger context. And so he says, within time the monsters would win, and all men and each man and all their works shall die, a theme no Christian need despise. Because in the end, it's not about what's inside time, it's about what is beyond time. And the deep truth is, they cannot conquer forever.
So I wanted to talk about death scenes. One of the things, first of all, to understand about hope in Tolkien, and this is a very important concept, a lot of Tolkien fans are familiar with this, is that there are two Elvish words for hope. There's the word estel, which has come up a couple times, and that's high hope. There's also amdir, which is the looking up. Amdir is what you have when you're saying, I think this is going to work out, right? I think we're going to succeed at this thing that we're trying to do. I have a good feeling about this, right? You have amdir. You're expressing amdir when you say that. Estel is much more like faith. I think that in my mind, the purest expression of Estel is when Galadriel says to Frodo, when he says, what do you want? And she says, that what should be shall be. Right, the trust that what should be shall be. That kind of deep trust, which ultimately is very much about faith, as in one of the letters that Giuseppe was quoting. Anyway, so Tolkien really played with these ideas in Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings. So he'd finished The Lord of the Rings, and he was writing some extra materials and going back and thinking through some things. So he did a lot with the character of Aragorn, and gave Aragorn both a backstory and a future story, at least a little bit. Aragorn's mother was named Gilrain, and she had a very difficult and tragic life. She was married very young to Aragorn's dad. Soon after Aragorn died, her husband was killed, and she, as sort of a refugee, went to Rivendell and was taken in by Elrond, and Aragorn was raised there. When he was raised there, Elrond decided we should probably conceal his name so that nobody knows who he is, because he had a sense that Aragorn was going to be important. So he was given the name Estel instead. Hope was literally Aragorn's name as a child. He did not even know his own real name until he would turn 20, and then he had a serious conversation with Elrond where he's like, actually, your name is Aragorn, not Estel, in fact. And that was also the day that Aragorn met Elrond's daughter, his future wife. It was a big day for him, but and then he goes right from there to meeting Arwen. So later on, he then goes out and he starts his wanderings, and he meets Gandalf, and he's doing all these things around the world. Gilrain moves back with her people, the Dunedain, and soon she's failing. He goes back to visit her, and she says to him, to Aragorn, I'm not going to live much longer. And he's like, but you're still, you're like not that old, Mom. Come on, like you could, And he says, like, there is hope that we'll get past. We'll get to the light beyond the shadow, and if we did, I would wish that you were there to see it. And she responds cryptically with an Elvish line and says, Onan I Estel Idain, Ucheben Estel Amin, which means, I gave hope to the Dunedain, but I have kept no hope for myself. And she soon dies. She says, I am worn down by cares. And she fails in Amdir. She's like, she can't hold out. He's trying to inspire Amdir in her. It might work out, Mom. I would like you to see that. Now, the irony here, the tragedy of that line, she's using the word Estel in that Elvish verse, as you could hear. But she's not actually talking about Estelle. To say, I have kept no Estelle for myself. Estelle is not a scarcity product. It's Umdir that she's failing in. But what she has lost is her Estelle. And Aragorn is very sad. And she does die soon thereafter, and he goes out again into the world. When Aragorn comes to die, he's succeeded, right? Spoilers, good guys win at the end of the Lord of the Rings, and Aragorn becomes king. This is why, by the way, Tolkien didn't love the title of The Return of the King. He's like, bit of a spoiler? Anyway, Aragorn becomes king, and in the appendix we learn that in the same appendix that eventually he comes to die. You know, he's very old. He lives to like 200 and something, but it's time, and he knows that it's time. And of course, Aragorn's death doesn't just come upon him. He makes the deliberate choice to follow in the path of the Númenórean kings, who, when they could feel that their time was over, instead of clinging to life and dwindling into like illness until finally sort of life is taken from them at the last gasp, the Númenórean kings had the tradition of laying down their lives. Like when they felt the time has come and they were being called, they would willingly give in to death. They would lay down their lives deliberately, which you'll notice is like what his mom did, right? Except she did it in despair instead of in hope. But when he comes to his end, he chooses to die in Estelle, and his last recorded words to his wife, he says, "In sorrow we must go, but not in despair. Behold, we are not bound forever to the circles of the world, and beyond them is more than memory. Farewell." And that's Estelle. That's high hope. To realize that, yes, death is sad. I'm going away, and it's okay to be sad that I'm going away. But beyond the circles of the world is more than memory. And his own Estelle does not waver. And he dies as the Númenórean kings did of old, in peace and in hope.
Thank you. I noticed a clear thread between what all of you have said, which I'll just point out and maybe ask you to speak a little bit more to. We can elaborate on this thread of sort of time and change that, as you said, Giuseppe, the point is not to embalm in the present. And that image of the tree, being brought from Lothlorien, a place of trying to embalm time, in a sense, or stop time, into Sam's garden at the end, where it can grow in a new place, in a new way, really ties to this idea that the end of the story, the horizon of the story, is not locked in time, which you were also speaking to in relation to death. So can you elaborate a little more on this for us and help us understand how Tolkien's thinking about time and the perspective of one's life?
Do you want to start?
Why don't you start?
Start. Okay. We told Annie before to stop us, okay, because we could go on forever and ever. So I will just focus a bit on the notion of time, because I think time is very important. And I don't know how many of you have read the Silmarillion, or at least know a bit about the story of the Silmarillion, but it's very important to, again, I won't sum up the story of the Silmarillion for you, but just one important thing is that time is essentially very linked to the, let's say, the essence of reality, so the essence of the world. Tolkien calls it the law of the world under the sun. It's the law of God. So there is something which goes very, very deep to the structure of reality to understand time. So time is essentially something that God wanted. We're not going to discuss how he came up about, because there is also something interesting in the way he came about. But at a certain point, certainly God decided to embrace time as part of his plan. And time is the time of development. So in the myth of the Silmarillion, at the beginning of the cosmogonic myth of the Silmarillion, the whole history of the world is in a way presented during a sort of concert. There is a concert, a polyphonic concert, and it is as if the whole history of the world happens once, in like as if it were a sort of Big Bang moment, if you want. But then there is a sort of second reinstantiation of the same event, and this is time. So time is the unfolding of the story we were heard before. So the unfolding of the story, this idea of unfolding of the story is closely related to the idea of authorship. If there is a story, there is an author. And this kind of dynamic of a contrast between the story that is unfolding and the author who is somehow in a mysterious way guiding history goes to the very depth of your question and also to the question of hope. At the end of the day, I just go back to a moment to the passage that Corey was referring to, which is the death of Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings, which is one of the most beautiful passages. And it's also the only passage in which the name of God is mentioned in the Lord of the Rings, the One. And it's mentioned, it's interesting, in a moment of rebellion, because Arwen, who is the wife of Aragorn, says at a certain point, I always thought that the Númenóreans, the people of Aragorn, were kind of foolish in not accepting death as the gift of God. But now that you're dying, I see why the gift of the One is bitter. And it's almost an act of rebellion in a sense. Okay, perhaps by Arwen, so it's a sort of noble elf who has married Aragorn, and there is a great pity and beauty even about the moment of rebellion against God, or at least of a sort of Jacob-like moment of fight with God. So the issue of time has to do with the issue of the authority in a way. So it has to do with the issue of who we are, where did we come from, where are we going, who is the author of reality, and what is our own identity. And the definition that Tolkien gives of Estelle, in fact, is the hope that is only founded in our identity of being the children of Ilúvatar, of God. So it's an act of submission, we may say, but in a positive sense. So it's an act in which we kind of acknowledge the authority of reality. Corey was saying before, Galadriel, my hope is that things that must be will happen.
That should be, shall be.
There should be, shall be. That's not an theoretical answer, okay? Mm-hmm. It's an answer which kind of implies the acknowledgement of an authority, or better, of an author, I would say.
Yeah. No, I think that idea of submission, as you say, is critical to the concept of Estelle. And I think it's the thing that differentiates the sort of simpler hope, Umdir, from Estelle, is that idea of submission. The elves are always struggling, Giuseppe, as you were saying before, they're always struggling with wanting to resist time. They don't like time, they don't like change. I mean, nobody does, but elves have a particular problem with it. And often have the power to make it at least seem like it's not happening, right? To be able to resist it in ways that people just can't resist it, right? But I do think that concept of submission is really crucial, to accept the big picture. This is the world that the One has created, right? And these are the gifts that the One has given. And so to accept that. And yet, the relationship with time is complicated because memory is good. Keeping alive the memory of that which is gone is very similar to desiring to stay there, right? Desiring to embalm time and to stay, so if an elf wants to keep time from moving and preserve the beauty of what was, that's going over the line. But to keep alive the memory of what was is a very good thing and a very important thing, right? So it's Tolkien thought a lot about this, mm-hmm. and it's a complicated situation.
But I want to just complicate it. I want to complicate it a little bit more then, because I think one of the issues that you get with when you read the Ainu Lundale, which is the creation myth by music, is you get this impression, which is I don't think Tolkien's intention, but you get this impression that we're sort of in a Calvinist predestined, everyone's just sort of following the thing that was played out in the music. And that's obviously not what he meant. And I think the best way I've found to understand it is, I don't know if you're familiar with a book by Chiara Bertoglio. She's a concert pianist who also is working about in Tolkien studies and other things. And her idea is if you think of that original music as like a musical score, right? God sets the musical score. This is the symphony. Everyone still has to play the part. And in fact, the musical score, as any musician here will tell you, doesn't tell you everything you need to know to play it. If you play just what's the sheets on the page, you sound like a robot, not like music. And that's us. That's the characters. That's their free will. That's why they have to, you can say they will not conquer forever because in the end, Eru is not his plan. But in terms of the local action, you still have to be like Sam and put one foot in front of the other and sacrifice and do what's right and what's right in front of you. And I really love that metaphor of working out a symphony, a score. It actually connects to another great author, Madeleine L'Angel, in A Wrinkle in Time, where she compares a human life to a sonnet in that there's 14 lines, there's a rigorous metrical scheme, there's a rigorous rhyme scheme, and within that do whatever you can. And the more that you work with the structure and go and cooperate with it, but even if you don't cooperate with it, and this is my favorite part, is when in the Enulindale, in the creation myth, the Diabolus, Melkor, he just wants, like, I imagine him as being like a trumpet player who just wanted solos all the time, and he's like just putting in his own, things, and they're dissonant, horrible notes. I mean, I'm thinking they're like all like minor sevenths all over the place. And yet they just keep coming out to make it even more beautiful. Like when you hear the seventh note in a scale put in somewhere, and it's going to resolve. And Eru says to him, Melkor will discover that nothing can be done in spite of my creation, that everything you do will resound to greater achievement. And that's, the evils that Melkor and Sauron did were evil. There's no, well, it's better off that happened or whatever. But no, what happens from that, and even Fëanor, the elf with, the most problematic of all the elves, is great and does terrible things. And he basically says, we're going to take this disaster and turn it into heroism and turn it into greatness and turn it into memories that people are going to have for as long as those memories are preserved. So I think that's the other side of hope, is that active and doing things because that's what we're meant to be in this world, are active agents to do things, not just to, as much as I would love to be somewhere where I could experience a perfect summer morning forever. That's not what we were put here to do. And we can still have that desire for that, but that's not what we live in.
Right, and even when I was talking about submission, that does not mean at all passivity, because to be submitted to the will of the one is to do the works that you can do that are
the free will. I mean, the reason the evil is in the world, right, is that free will allows evil as well as good, and if you blocked one somehow, you wouldn't have either.
Yeah, to use the time that is given to you, right, that's the purpose.
Can I just add a quote that came to me, which I think is very important, kind of linking everything, which is the ending of on fairy tales, on fairy stories. And Tolkien even talks about Christianity, so the Christian. And just read it because it kind of adds up maybe a final important tesseract of the mosaic. And Tolkien says, the Christian has still to work. So this is even after the incarnation, after the resurrection. So in a way, in our post-Christian world, so not the pre-Christian world, which in a way is similar. The Christian has still to work, with mind as well as body, to suffer, to hope, and to die. But, and that's really the but, he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose, which can be redeemed. It's the idea of redemption, which is what Michael was alluding. And there is no evil that God cannot redeem. There is not little elements of our lives that cannot be redeemed. And that's, I think, where the power of God lies. So even this element of submission is linked to hope, because it's the hope that anything can have a purpose. And I think that's what was missing.
And that's what fits with what you just said there, is where my controversial opinion that Boromir is one of the great heroes of The Lord of the Rings rather than a villain or a failure exactly because after he fails, and he fails, right? He was tempted by the ring. He gave into the temptation. He tried to take the ring from Frodo. And then he does the most heroic thing that anyone except maybe Eowyn does in the entire giant story, which is he fights 100 orcs against one man and kills 20 of them and blows his horn at the right time so that those orcs think there's more Boromirs coming. And so they run away. They grab Merry and Pippin, they run away. If he doesn't do that, everyone's going to die. Right, because Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli are going to come back and get killed by these orcs. The orcs are going to have time to search for Frodo and Sam and find that they've crossed the river and tell the Nazgul on the other side of the river to sorts of... Boromir saves everything. And he saves everything in his moment of greatest shame. And you know, he says, I tried to take the ring from Frodo. I am sorry. I have failed. And Aragorn says, no, few have had such a victory. He's not talking about orcs.
Yeah. I've always loved that scene. Because I agree, Boromir gets a bad rap all over the place. Yeah, you have conquered, right? No, you have conquered.
Because he failed and didn't give up.
Because he didn't give up,
and
yes.
didn't do what his father does, which is descend into... In the Middle Ages, this was called wanhope. Yeah. Right? It's actually the sin of sloth. We think of sloth as just being lazy, but to the people in the Middle Ages, sloth was saying... What I've done is so bad that God will never forgive me for it, and I might as well quit. Yeah. And Boromir
does not quit, even in that. And as you say, it's not like he has time to recover and like move past this. It's like,
and then he's beatified. I mean, he's floating in the boat, dead, and he's glowing. I mean, if that's not a saint's life, I don't know what.
And if I may add something which I think is really very beautiful and has to do with what we were saying before about the new life, even the title of this encounter. What does Boromir do? What's the object of the heroism? To save the hobbits, to save Merry and Pippin, to allow at least that Merry and Pippin can... and if you think about that, this is crazy. I mean, and that's what has been always the big challenge for Boromir, to accept that the kind of... the author of the story has decided to save the East of Middle-earth with hobbits. And he resisted until the very, very end.
Yes.
And his moment of redemption has to do maybe finally to the recognition that the methodology that the author of the story has chosen is very closely linked to the Hobbit. So with the weakest, the most neglected, the most unexpected creatures of Middle-earth. And this is so beautiful as well. And Aragorn follows suit very soon, because then when he has to decide what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to go to Minas Tirith and sell Frodo. No, he goes and save...
I'm going to go save Merry and Pippin.
Which doesn't make any sense.
No, not at all.
It doesn't make any sense in the geopolitical sense, but it makes sense in you do what's in front of you that's right. And I think that is such a strong view of Tolkien throughout the whole story, is that so often I think we get, this is our leaders and ourselves and anyone else, we get to this idea that, well, we got to solve that giant problem over there. Mm-hmm. So in fact, I'm going to do a little injustice or something wrong here.
It
doesn't really matter because we're going to solve the big problem later. And the Tolkien's view on this is, and it's done, by the plot, right? It doesn't give lectures on it, except for Gandalf says we must clear the fields in front of us and not worry about what weather they're going to have in the future. But it's that you take the action and you do the right thing in front of you, and then you do the next and you do the next, and I think that is very, very powerful idea.
No, I agree. It's very means and ends is a major theme.
The anti-Machiavelli.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone who is attempting to achieve a good end, but has the opportunity to do something wrong in order to achieve that and goes there, that's always wrong. And to say it the other way, as you were saying, Aragorn's choice at that moment, it seems incredibly foolish. Like everything relies on Frodo's success. Do I go with Frodo? Do I chase Frodo down? He could catch him, undoubtedly. And help him. Like, that's obviously what matters. I should let everything else go. But Aragorn in that moment says, no, Merry and Pippin are going to be tortured and killed. It would be wrong to turn away from them. And so therefore, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this. I'm going to take the step, which is obviously the right thing to do in front of me right now, the thing that I clearly have the immediate moral responsibility to do, trusting that that's going to pan out. And of course it does, right? Whereas who knows what would have happened had he taken the other route. But again, that's another place where that trust, where that submission, people don't think of that moment as an expression of hope, of Estelle, but it clearly is. Like he does not think that it's up to him.
Exactly. In fact, he says there are other powers at work.
There are other powers at work,
they're kind of discussing and debating with Merry and Pippin about what to do, he says there are other powers at work. So it's also an exegetical moment. It's not just an ethical moment. It's not just just kind of, yes, he's doing the right thing, but he's also doing the right thing because he acknowledges that in a sort of meta-literary way, as a character is acknowledging that the author is moving the story forward in a way. So it's an act of adherence, if you want. Meta-literary adherence, I will even say.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of ends, can we talk a bit about the end of The Lord of the Rings in light of everything you've been talking about? Because it doesn't end in Minas Tirith with Aragorn in a triumphant, scene. Frodo has to leave Middle-earth, right? He's too wounded to remain in the Shire. Why does Tolkien end this way?
I think it's a thing that's too little appreciated, especially by people who don't know Tolkien well. A lot of people read Tolkien or see the movies and are like, oh, everything's all black and white, right? All the good guys win and everything's happy and it's really simplistic. And I'm like, did you actually read the story? Like, that's not, in fact, how it ends. Tolkien is extremely connected to the reality of loss and sorrow. And that's the note on which, the dominant note, not the very, very final note. The very final note is Sam coming back home to Rosie and his daughter and saying, well, I'm back. Right?
Ursula Le Guin says that's the most heartbreaking line in all of fantasy literature.
Oh man, it is so powerful. But the loss of Frodo. Frodo is the hero, right? Frodo succeeds. The bad guy is defeated. And yet Frodo says, I am too deeply wounded. I can't stay. It's not going to be okay for me, right? My only hope is to go. But now he is going to seek healing. But the loss, Sam's loss, the sadness, not only of losing Frodo, but of Gandalf and Galadriel and Elrond and all of the ring bearers, the past, the great past passing away. I mean, it's a departure. It's a loss. And so this to me makes Tolkien's emphasis on hope so much more powerful, because hope with Tolkien is never just a pep talk, right? It's never just like, it's okay, folks, things will be fine, really. Like, that's not Tolkien's idea. He is constantly, through the victory, through the triumph, in touch with the fact that there is sorrow, there is loss, there is pain, there is parting. And yet persisting in hope, in Estelle, in and through that.
This is what Tolkien has Frodo say, is that sometimes in order for other people to have happiness, someone has to give it up. That's his experience as a soldier. It's his experience that the damage to his health. You read the biography and it's very like, oh, he had trench fever, and since we don't have that anymore, people don't take it seriously enough. My dad treated people in the 1970s in New York City who had trench fever. There were homeless people there who lived in lived in their clothes, and he described trench fever to me as sort of like a supercharged Lyme disease, and it only is cured with antibiotics, and the antibiotics to cure it weren't invented until the late 1950s. So Tolkien was suffering very serious health things for a long time as a result of his experiences in the war, and I think he had this idea that many people sacrificed that happiness so that others could have it, and that it was noble, but it also couldn't be forgotten. And I think that's the thing about Frodo. And it's also that you put out that line, everything's black and white. None of it's black and white. It's not even like just like that the bad guys have, complex choices. The good guys do things wrong all the time. Yeah. You have to read it carefully. But I would say that one of the biggest things in there is that Frodo has done, and knows it, has done wrong things. And not just that he couldn't throw the ring away at the Samath Nahar, but that he has used the ring to dominate Gollum. And by the way, he had no choice. His choices at that moment were he could kill Gollum in cold blood in a murder. I don't think that would have gone well. He could have just left Gollum alone to kill him and Sam and take the ring and Middle-earth. Or he could do what he's been told not to do, which is use the power of the ring to dominate Gollum. And he does it once, and that's the moment that he starts feeling the weight of the ring, and that's when Sam has to take over the whole quest. And then he does it again. And he actually is abusive to Gollum because he just goes further than necessary. You can see the ring working on even supposedly perfect Frodo. And he never gets over that. Right? He's trying at the end when he says, after Gollum's bit his finger off, right? He says, "Let us forgive him, Sam." So he knows there's something to forgive there. I just think that like the book, when you said that, it just drives me crazy because it's about hope, but it's about the real hope. That's why it's so powerful. Yeah. If it was just about everything's going to be all right, no, but it's like even when everything is not all right, there's still, the Malorn tree is still growing in the Shire.
The one final thing, completely what just been said, a final thing on the ending, which I think has also to do with the function of literature and its connection with hope. And I quote from a letter, which is one of my favorite letters. And Tolkien says, "A story must be told or there'll be no story. Yet it is the untold stories that are most moving. I think you like my stories because they convey a sudden sense of endless untold stories. Mountains seen far away, never to be climbed. Distant trees never to be approached, or if so, only to become near trees, unless in paradise." I quote this because at the end of the Rings, in a way, we have got up to the mountain. So we have seen the victory and so on. But to have a true story, to have a story which kind of really fulfills the function of literature, if you want, we need to see a new vista, in a way. That's, in a way, what we see at the end of the Lord of the Rings. It's like the frame of the picture, to quote on the Tolkien expressions, opens up and we see that actually the story never ends. Great tales never end, Tolkien says. So we need, in a way, the sense of sadness, of nostalgia, because we know that we are not up to the top of the mountains yet, and will never be in this life, which goes back to what we were saying about time and what the idea of beyond the circles of the world. We keep walking and we see the top of the mountain, and this is already fulfilling in a way. There is something beautiful and human about it. But the only reason why we can hope in our journey is because we know that there will be an end at the end. It's this kind of strange dynamic between time and eternity, if you want, between the journey and final end. And the final end is not here. Which doesn't mean that what we do here doesn't have any sense, but the function, the beauty of what we do here, it depends on its connection to the eternity. Everything can be redeemed by something which is beyond the circles of the world. So the ending is necessary. It's also from a narrative point of view. It will be a very bad ending, which was the ending of The Hobbit. Tolkien really kind of, Bilbo and Tolkien agonize a bit about the end of The Hobbit, because the end of The Hobbit is a happy ending at the beginning, and Tolkien was clearly convinced that there was not the right ending. And in fact, if we read The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo is obsessed about his ending, and eventually decides not to finish The Hobbit because he understands that the tale is going on through Frodo.
So I think we, probably all of us in this room, in some respective experience, the power of the story that you were just alluding to and the poignancy. And so I want you to tell us a little bit, as readers of Tolkien, as scholars of Tolkien, why is it so moving for readers? Why does it kind of cross fiction to reality and actually seem to give hope to people?
So this is hard. I'm having, it's challenging for me to express all of this, but I can tell you a little bit about what Tolkien can and can't do, but can do. In 2022, we lost our son to an overdose. And these quotes that my colleagues have been using were the things that we put on the funeral program and excuse me, and other stuff like that. And I've thought about this a lot. I have a book coming out in the fall called The Tower and the Ruin, J.R.R. Tolkien's creation. And I tried to end it thinking about what his vision and what his story does. And I wish I had been able to say, oh, it gave consolation and everything's great. But that's not, and that's an impossible standard, right? That's an impossible standard to ask. Like, oh, can it console you for the loss of a child? No, it can't. But here's what it can do. And I look at the end of the essay on fairy stories. And Tolkien quotes this fairly obscure fairy tale called The Black Bull of Norway, right? Which is an awful, it's from Scotland, but it's very Grimm's fairy tale. Just horrible things happen. It's a washerwoman's daughter, and she's given this gift of this black bull, which turns out to be like the prince she's meant to marry in bull form. She's separated from him because she moves her leg when she's been told to sit still. Then she ends up in a valley, the sides of which are glass, so she can't climb out, except that she has to serve with a blacksmith for 7 years, and then he makes iron shoes, which he nails to her feet, so she can climb out. Then she ends up at a place where she's supposed to wash this bloody shirt that no one, if you can get the blood out of the shirt, you can marry the sleeping prince, and that's her true love. But there's a witch, and the witch is trying to give it to her daughter, and there's just one horrible thing after another. And it's the normal fairy tale thing where there's like a repetition of 3, right? So she's told, okay, you can marry him if you can wake him up with your singing, but the witch gives him a sleeping potion. So the first night, and he doesn't wake up. And the second night, and he doesn't wake up. And now it's the third night, and this is it. This is everything done. And she's singing, and she says, 7 long years I served for thee. The glassy hill I clomb for thee. The bloody shirt I rang for thee. And wilt thou now waken and turn to me? And he turned to her. That's the moment, right? And so on our very worst day, when the tears of his mother, his father, and his sister fell on Mitchell's face, and he didn't turn, but what you could imagine was a world in which he did turn, in which the resurrection happened, in which the greatest, and I tried to think of what it was like for the disciples to see the empty tomb and to know, and this is what Tolkien says. He says, we can imagine. I say we can imagine this world in which we get, and this is Tolkien's words, a piercing glimpse of joy, the heart's desire that for a moment passes outside the frame and rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam through. And that's what Tolkien got a glimpse of that. And the horns of Rohan at cockcrow. Or Gandalf saying, the realm of Sauron is ended. And it was. That's the glimpse of the truth. And that's, I think, what we have to hang everything on. The empty tomb. The glimpse of light. The star. Sorry about that. I did not plan that. See, maybe you shouldn't improvise.
It is one of the great powers of The Lord of the Rings is that, it's funny because sometimes it's another one of these things that people say. A lot of times when people are praising Tolkien, they will say, Tolkien is amazing because everything in the story is just worked out in this incredible detail. It's so rich and it's so deep. And it's not that that's untrue, but I don't think that that's actually the reason why the story is so powerful. The story is so powerful because of all the things he doesn't say. Tolkien is a master at engaging and invoking our own imaginations, so that when people read Tolkien, they don't even realize how much of the story they themselves are creating in their own minds and filling in their own minds. And how much of the larger history they are invited to imagine, ways in which they are invited to make Middle-earth their own and to put themselves within Middle-earth. And there are just generations of people who have had that experience. And I think it's one of the things that makes Tolkien's insights, the things, Mike, that you were talking about, make these things so powerful and so personal to people. I mean, lots of people, will have favorite stories or favorite movies or whatever, and things that really speak to them, and that's wonderful. But for my experience anyway has been that people who love Tolkien have an unusually high degree of that kind of connection to it. And it's almost like to love Tolkien is to have it shape your life and your outlook in some ways, to have it become, because you have been invited to live there and to connect with it and to allow it to shape you as well, to find that is, I often, have myself found, articulating my own experience. Like when I'm trying to figure out how to say something, it will often be Tolkien quotes and Tolkien scenes that will come to my mind. And so it's always more convenient when I'm trying to explain myself to Tolkien fans, rather than I'm often left at a difficulty when I'm trying to.
It's always good, right, to use an analogy like, oh, that's like in the Silmarillion, and the people who go, that's not helping.
Yeah, that's true.
To be honest, I don't think I have to add much, because I think what Michael, especially and Corey, already said for me answer to your question, so it would be a repetition. But I just will say one thing about the repetition, okay? Because that's, I think, something which is very Tolkienian. In a way, what Michael was sharing now is the story of the Lord of the Rings, is the story of the Gospel, and I think that's the beauty of Tolkien, which is every single story is both unique, because it's his story, Tolkien's story, even made-up story, my own story, Corey's story, and yet all these stories kind of participate with the same narrative, underlying narrative in a way. So they participate with only, at the end of the day, with only one single story, which is the story of the incarnation and resurrection, as Michael was saying. So I think I like Tolkien because it's as if he gives the hope that my story can be, if you will, grafted into the Tree of Tales. So there is only one Tree of Tales, which has as the root and the foundation, the Gospel story. And by reading Tolkien, we are kind of drawn into that. We are given the hope that our story suddenly can become something meaningful, something that actually has a narrative which makes sense, that can be redeemed, it can participate in a greater narrative. And I think that's the hope that we are given. We are unique, we don't have to give up who we are, but at the same time we participate with something which is greater.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.
What more to say than just invite ourselves for more of this encounter, more of this moment. Our next event is a feeling of precariousness in the Pavilion Auditorium at 11:30. Let's join and thank our speakers again.